So what are some properties of squares? How can we define this as a relationship? Well, one important thing about squares is regardless of where they are in relation to other objects, the thing that makes it a square is that the height and the width are the same. So let's take a look at how we can tell it that that's what we want. So in the alignment menu, we got leading edges, trailing edges, top, bottom. None of these really have anything to do with telling the view its height or its width or their relationship. So that's not really what we want. Let's try out the pin menu. Okay, so here we go. So we already know these are for setting the spacing to the neighbors. And here we've got our height and our width. But we don't want to set explicit values. We don't want the square to be really big on the iPod and then really small on the iPad if we give it set values. Just to show what we don't want, let's go ahead and add these. And as soon as you type in a value, even if you didn't check it, when you hit tab, it knows that that means you definitely want it. So it'll check it for you, which is a really nice feature. So let's go ahead and add those. Let's add those constraints to tell it we want a square. We want our view to be 100 by 100. Okay, great. So we can see we're getting 100 by 100, but we're definitely getting conflicting constraints now because telling it to be 100 by 100 messes with the spacing that we told it to have. So let's see, what kind of conflicting constraints are we getting? I feel like we want our square to be centered. So maybe what we should do now is actually turn off those other constraints. Now if you look here, it looks like we've only got the same 4 constraints. So where did our constraint go that told our view to have a certain height and a certain width? Well, if you look here, you'll notice that there's now a drop down on our view. Inside of our view, we have another set of constraints. And we open that up, and here we have our height and our width. So why are these in 2 different places? We haven't run into the issue yet before because we're working with a very small number of objects. Really, the smallest number of objects you can have and still do stuff with auto layout. And the way that constraints are located is that they are a child of the view that is the closest common ancestor between the 2 objects. It's kind of a mouthful, but the important thing to remember is that these constraints only have to do with the red view. Therefore, they belong to the red view. But because these constraints have to do with both the super view and our red view, they belong to the super view. So constraints can point to the view that they belong to, as well as views that are also children of that view. Now, if this doesn't make sense, you don't necessarily need to understand it right now. The important thing is just to know that if you feel like you're missing some constraints, they might be under a different view than where you expect them. And once you work with auto layout more, you'll get more familiar with where to look to find those constraints. So going back to what we were trying to do, we want to make sure that we remove the conflicts that we're having. And the best way to do that right now is just select all of these ones and uninstall them. We don't want to completely delete them right now because we're kind of not really sure if we need them or not. And instead of deleting them completely, again, we can just uninstall them to see what things are like without them. So without them, we see that our red view has sort of jumped up into the corner and disappeared a bit on most of the screens. So we do still need to add back some more constraints because right now our view knows what size it is, but it doesn't know where it is. And you can see right here that we've got this little guide saying, hey, go up in the top corner because you didn't tell me anything else, so you should be at 0, 0. But we don't want to be at 0, 0. We want to be centered. So let's add those constraints to be centered in both ways. So again, that's in the alignment menu. And we want to be horizontal and vertical center in the container. And let's add those 2 constraints. Perfect. So this is what I was talking about before, where relative to the size of the screen, our square appears or feels much smaller on the iPad screen than it does on the iPhone. They're technically the exact same size, but from the user's perspective, it just looks very lost in all that white space on the iPad. So I think what we actually want to go for is we want to have the largest square possible without getting too close to the edges. So think about that for a minute. Think about what kinds of constraints could we possibly add to get that sort of effect. Now, as you may recall, I mentioned before that we can have an aspect ratio. So let's try that. Let's make sure we're selected our view, and let's see where we can find that. No, it's not over here. But in the pin menu, we have an aspect ratio option right here. Now let's select that and add it. So we can see it got added over here. Again, it only has to do with the red view, so that's where it has been created. So let's click on that and take a closer look. So here we're saying we're comparing the red width to the red height. So in both cases, the object is the same and the items are just the different attributes of our red view. And the relationship is equal. We want them to be the same. There's no constant. Priority is 1,000, which we should keep it at because we want a square. So this definitely should be mandatory. And then down here we can see our multiplier, and this is 1 to 1. So this is where our ratio can be defined. And you know it's a ratio because it's got this colon in the middle. And this says the first part should be this big relative to the second part. And here, 1 to 1 means that they're equal. So it would be the same if we said they were 2 to 2, both equal. But if we said 2 to 1, that changes things. That now means that the width, which is the first item, is a 2 when the height is a 1. So this is a multiplier. So it's not really just a height of 1 and the width of 2, but what it does is it takes the height of our red view and it multiplies it by 2 to get our width. Now you can have more complex multipliers. We could have 2 to 5. And now in this case, it's taller than it is wide because now this number is bigger. And you can look more into ratios on your own if you're not already familiar with them. But the important thing to know is that it's comparing the relative size of the first item to the relative size of the second item. But again, to get that square, we want to go 1 to 1. There's also a couple pre-built options in here. You can also reverse the multiplier if you accidentally made it wider than tall, but you want it the other way around, or convert to decimal. But in this case, again, we've got these presets here, and we just want to stick with 1 to 1. So now that we have that, maybe we can get rid of our height and width. So let's uninstall them. Nope, that's no good. So now it doesn't know either of those values. So we're getting a height and a width of 0 again. So let's just pick one of them. Let's pick height, and let's install it again. All right, great. So now that we've told it that the height is 100, it knows that the width has to be 100 as well because of the aspect ratio. So this is great. We're making it slightly more robust. So now if we change the height, so it's at 100, if we change it to 200, we should see that it stays a square. And it does. Now it's just a bigger square. But we still want to get away from telling it explicitly what the height is. So let's see maybe about turning this off and seeing if we can use some of our previous constraints to get back to what we want, which is a square. So with our height selected, let's uninstall. And let's look at our constraints and think about which ones could we turn back on to get what we want. So now let's take a look at what our missing constraints are to see what our options are for redefining it. Okay, so we either need an X position and a Y position or the height and width. Well, we already tried the height and width. That wasn't really what we wanted. So let's try giving it an X and a Y position. So we already have some of those. So let's just try turning them back on. So let's find the one for the leading edge. So that was a horizontal one. So let's take a look. Okay, so this one is for the trailing edge, which we could do, but let's go ahead and do the leading edge. And let's just turn that one back on. Okay, great. So we've got our square again. That's fantastic. So even though we haven't told it the height or the width, again, it's able to figure it out because we have a leading edge and we know that we're centered. So it's matching this leading edge with a trailing edge. And because we told it it's a square, and because we told it it's got an aspect ratio of 1 to 1, it's maintaining its square shape. So this is actually looking pretty good. We've got our minimum spacing on the side, the square's not going off the screen. Let's run it in the simulator and make sure that we're getting exactly what we want with that Command R. Oh, fantastic. Fantastic. So let's make sure that it works in all orientations. So let's rotate it to the left. Oh no, so that's a problem. So this is no good. We want it to be a square all the time, and I'm sure you can figure out that it's still a square, but it's getting cut off. And the reason for this is because we said we want the horizontal space to be a certain distance. But because now the screen is wider than it is tall, that means that our square is becoming too tall for the screen. But we want it to be limited in height as well whenever the screen is shorter than the width. So let's unrotate, and let's think about how we can do that. So let's stop our simulator. And maybe what we can do is, over here in our preview, let's just rotate one. There we go. And this will help give us a clue before we get to the simulator that we probably still need to fix something because it's not working in this orientation. So it seems like what we need to do is we need to add a margin. We need to tell it that there definitely has to be a margin on the top and the bottom. So let's go over to our vertical space and let's try this second one. Right, okay, so that's from red to the top. So that's definitely the one we want. Let's turn it back on. Okay, well, we got our margins back, but okay, now it's sort of jumped over. It's no longer centered. So it looks like it's decided that the most important thing is to be a square and to have these margins, and it's now less important to be centered. But we still want it to be centered, so how can we handle this? Well, one thing that you may remember is that all this time we've been using equal relationships. But really, we have the option to do less than or equal as well as greater than or equal. So let's think about this for a second. From our red view to the top, we want it to be 50 or more. Because when our phone is rotated this way, by default, it has to have more space up here. So it'll be 50 or more. So let's go ahead and change that relationship. So now it's going to be greater than or equal to 50. Oh, wow. So that looked like it made just the changes we need. Let's just double check when we rotate. Okay. Something's still not right. Now we don't have any missing or conflicting constraints. So let's think about what might be happening. It works here, but not when we rotate. Well, it worked for that constraint. So what if we just add that to this one as well? So let's click on our horizontal leading edge constraint and change that relationship to greater than or equal as well. Okay, so now we have a problem. It's gone away. And we can see that now we do have an error. So let's go and see what's happening. So we need a constraint for our y position or our height. So what's happening? We told it greater than or equal to 50. But the problem is that there are an infinite number of numbers that are greater than or equal to 50. So what's happened again is that it has chosen one of those many combinations that is not where we want it on the screen. So we still need an x position or a height. So right now it's probably setting us to, so let's go back. So we gave it a y position in a sense, but it's not exact. So maybe we do need to add back one of these values. So let's click on our height. That's what it wanted. And let's reinstall it. Okay, so we can see them over here, and it looks like it's still missing here, but let's just see if maybe we can update our frames. Okay, so that worked. And you may also notice here that we've even got a little less than or equal to sign on these two constraints now, just to remind you which kind of constraints that you're using. So let's see if we rotate it over here. Let's rotate. Okay, so we've got our square, and it's centered in both situations. And let's run it with Command R and see if it works in Simulator in the same way. Okay, so that looks good. And then we want to command the left arrow. Fantastic. So we've got it centered and it's a square in both orientations. That's basically what we wanted. But you might notice that the spacing here looks a little bit bigger than it was before. And that's because, again, it's applying the greater than or equal to 50. So right now, it's greater than 50 because we told the height to be 100. And as you can see here, again, the squares are the same size on both screens, but we want the iPad to be as big as possible without going too close to the margins. So let's see if we can just change the height. So let's go over here and let's change it to 500. Okay, well, so that worked good for the iPad, but now it's too big on the iPhone again. But wait, we can set a priority. So right now, all of our priorities are still at 1000. We've changed some of our relationships to be less than or equal to provide some flexibility, but now we can actually use priority in a real sense. So what's more important? Because that's what we need to know before we change priorities. Is it more important that our square be height 500? Or is it more important that it have the correct spacing from the edges? In this case, we definitely want the spacing from the edges to be more important. So what we're going to do is we're going to reduce the priority on our height. So let's bump it down to high. It's still important because we still want it to be big when it can be big, but we don't want it to be big at the sacrifice of our margins. So let's try 750. Great, so that worked really well. It looked like our iPhone screen is how we want it now. On the iPad, it still looks a little small. Well, maybe we can let's just change our constant here. We'll try 600. Okay, that works. Still might be some more room, so let's try 700. All right, let's see. Does 800 go any bigger? No. So it looks like, in this sense, we just made it really big. We gave it a slightly lower priority. So now what it does is it satisfies all the other constraints having to do with margins and being centered and having the right aspect ratio. And then it gets as close as possible to this constraint, to this constant, as it can. So now we can see that when we rotate this iPad screen, it keeps those minimum margins and stays a square. And of course, just to be sure, we want to run in the simulator. And again, let's rotate it. Great. We've got what we started out to make.